Well, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice is back in the Bay Area, where she is a fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. Rice served under President George W. Bush during some of the most turbulent times in recent U.S. history. She is writing a 3-book memoir. The first out this fall, called Extraordinary Ordinary People, is about her parents and her early life. I spoke with Dr. Rice at a recent fundraising event for low-income women with breast cancer, held by Friends of Faith, named for KTVU reporter Faith Fancher. Here are excerpts from my conversation with Dr. Rice about her work growing up in Alabama and her own mother's battle with breast cancer.
Well, I'm here because I believe strongly in efforts like Friends of Faith that help women to cope with the devastating disease of breast cancer. My mother, though she ultimately succumbed at 61, I was only 15 years old when she first had breast cancer. And because I was 30, when she finally succumbed, at least she got to see me grow up. And so I'm someone who believes very strongly in this cause.
When you have a parent who's had the disease, does the fear factor play any part in your life and the decisions that you've made?
It has meant being very careful about how I live, about how I take care of myself. But I think the most important thing is that it teaches you to really love every day and know that nothing can be taken for granted.
How did you and your dad and your mom handle the diagnosis?
Well, I'll read a little bit from a book that I'm writing about my parents and my family. You know, people ask me all the time, how did you get to be who you are? Mm-hmm. And I say you had to know John and Angelina Rice in order to have an answer to that question.
Well, you mentioned your book. It is the first in a series, I understand, and you chose to write about your family first and then your career later. I guess we should ask you to read a little bit about that.
Can I do
what
that?
happened then. You can certainly do that.
I knew that Mother had a doctor's appointment that Friday, but didn't think much of it. Daddy always dropped me off at school each day and picked me up afterward. School ended about 3:30. I waited and waited. When he finally arrived, he explained that he had been at the doctor's office. Mother had gone to Dr. Hamilton because she had felt a lump in her breast, and she was still with the doctor who was doing some tests. When Daddy and I arrived at the doctor's office, the doctor explained that he could not be sure, but the lump felt like cancer to him. In those days, you didn't wait for a second opinion or analysis. Mother would have surgery on Monday. It was likely that she would lose her right breast, and then we would see what else could be done. That weekend was consumed with preparations for her hospital stay. I will never forget the sight of Mother cooking, making and freezing chicken and beef roast and vegetables so that we would have enough to eat while she was hospitalized. I suspected she was trying to get her mind off what she was facing. In 1970, cancer was a death sentence. I could tell that she was scared. I could tell that Daddy was scared, and I was terrified. My father was deeply affected too. He told me that his prayers had been answered, though. When learning of my mother's diagnosis, he asked God not to take her. How will I raise a 15-year-old alone? He asked. He did not have to. Over the years, Daddy more often gave voice to his fears than Mother did, telling me, for example, but apparently not telling my mother, that many of the doctors he'd spoken to had informed him that the cancer really would never go away. Those little seeds lie dormant, and you never know if they'll strike again, he said. The fact is, from that brutal Monday forward, our tight-knit family's sense of security was shaken by the infiltration of cancer into our consciousness. That was the new normal.
You come from just an absolutely outstanding family. You grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Yet the story of your parents and their ability to overcome all kinds of odds and not carry the mark of segregation with them, how do you think they did it?
My parents believed very strongly, as did their parents, that you might not be able to control your circumstances, but you could control how you reacted to your circumstances. Now, I'm actually not even the first PhD in my family. Because of my grandfather on my father's side, a man named John Wesley Rice Sr., When he was growing up in Utah, that would be E-U-T-A-W, Alabama, I'm not kidding. He was a sharecropper's son there, and he decided to get book learning. So he asked how a colored man could go to college. They told him he could go to Little Stillman College, a Presbyterian school. So he saved up his cotton. He went off to Stillman. After the first year, he didn't have any more cotton or any money. So they said, you're going to have to leave. And he said, how are those boys going to college? And they said, well, you see, they have what's called a scholarship. And if you wanted to be a Presbyterian minister, then you could have a scholarship too. And my grandfather said, that's exactly what I had in mind. And my family's been Presbyterian and college educated ever since. The education gene is what I really inherited. The bedrock belief that if you can get a good education, you're going to be able to make it in this country.
You did grow up in tough times, though. When you were 8 years old, you were confronted with an incident that shook the world. It was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, in which 4 young black girls, Negro girls as they were called them, were killed. One of them was a classmate of yours.
Well, there's no doubt that it left a mark. Denise McNair was a friend. We played with dolls together. Everybody in Birmingham, in my little community of Titusville, which was a little black middle-class community, everybody in that community knew at least one of those little girls. And so it was a deeply personal loss for all of us. And it was at first, the community was just sad and then angry. And of course, it reminds you what hatred can do. And as I went out into the world, particularly as Secretary of State, I watched again what hatred could do. And it always hearkened me back to listen to, for instance, Palestinian mothers and Israeli mothers, and to know that they must feel some of what my mother felt, that feeling that you might put your child to bed at night and maybe something would happen, that child would never wake up.
You and your dad had many things in common, including this one fact. John Wesley Rice was a Democrat. Yes. Who decided to become a Republican. Yes. Condoleezza Rice was a Democrat who decided to become a Republican.
My father's story is a little bit more complicated than my own. Remember, this is Alabama. He goes to register to vote in 1952 with my mother, who he was dating at the time, and they had what was called a poll test. So they asked my mother, who was very fair-skinned, very beautiful, they asked my mother, the man did, you're a teacher, right? And she said, yes. And he said, then you probably know who the first president of the United States was. And she said, yes, George Washington. He said, fine. He passed her through. My father came up and he said, how many beans are in this jar? And my father was devastated by this. So he went back and he was talking to an old elder in his church, Mr. Frank Hunter. Mr. Hunter said, you know, don't worry, Reverend Rice. He said, I know how to get you registered. He said, there's a clerk down there and she's a Republican. He said, she'll register anybody who will say that they're a Republican. So my father went down. He said he was a Republican. He got registered. And from then on, he was a very loyal Republican. I, on the other hand, came to the Republican Party because of foreign policy. I was a specialist on the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And the best that President Carter could do was to boycott the Olympics. I decided that we needed a new direction, and I voted for Ronald Reagan.
It's hard to imagine you're being able to do all the things that you've done without somewhere running into sexism. Traveling in the Middle East must have been a challenge because of the culture.
When you are Secretary of State, people go out of their way to be nice to you. They really don't want to get on the bad side of the Secretary of State. I found it something of an advantage to be female. And there was one very important reason for this, and that is that I felt I could model or pattern for women in the Middle East the potential for a better future than they have. The Middle East is failing to the degree that it is because it treats its women, too many places treat their women badly. And I can tell you that if you find a society that treats its women badly, it's a dangerous society. And if I could do any one thing, I would empower women worldwide. I would always have one really interesting experience. I'd be at the end of a meeting with some very, very conservative Shia cleric who couldn't shake hands with me because I was woman. But at the end, he would say, "Would you wait here for a minute? I want you to meet my 13-year-old granddaughter." And out would come this little covered girl who would say, "Oh, I've seen you on television. I want to be just like you." And I would think, you know, he's prejudiced. But somehow beneath that prejudice is a grandfather who wants life to be better for his granddaughter. And ultimately, that's going to be the saving grace of this part of the world.
What is the toughest decision that you had to make in these very political roles that you played?
Well, the toughest decisions are always those that relate to war and peace. And because of September 11th, we had a lot of them. And you know, if you were in a position of authority on September 11th, every day after that was September 12th. We were faced with some difficult decisions, and so anything having to do with war and peace, Afghanistan, Iraq, and in my case, one case of Lebanon, where war had broken out between Israel and Lebanon. I was negotiating the ceasefire, and I had to stand next to Fuad Signora, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, a man for whom I had enormous respect, whose country was being laid waste by the war. And I had to say to him, "I'm not going to be able to do this until we can deal with Hezbollah." And that was very, very hard indeed.
What criticism has been the toughest for you to take?
I don't spend too much time worrying about criticism. If you did, you'd simply drive yourself crazy, drive your blood pressure up, and you know, be mad at people all the time. So it's not worth it. But I used to tell the press, much to their chagrin, Belva, that today's headlines and history's judgment are rarely the same, and I'll wait for history's judgment. When people would question truthfulness or motives, that really bothered me. And you know, we see it now. We see people do the same thing on the other side, and somehow we ought to be able, in a great democracy like this, to have policy differences and not assume the worst of those who disagree with us.
Do you have any interests at all in entering politics?
No. I have a lot of respect, enormous respect, for people who run for office. And we get a lot of good people to run for office. But you know, our process is very tough, and I'm not one who believes it's too tough. You want to see people when they're tired. You want to know how people react when they're angry. So I think the process is just fine. But I also know that you'd better be someone who's energized by it, not innervated by it. And you better have a fire in the belly to run for office that I simply don't have. There are lots of ways to do public service. I myself, after the 8 years in Washington, have come back. I have a lot of interest particularly in K-12 education, because I'm a great believer that what holds us together as Americans is what I'll call our great national myth. And a myth isn't something that is untrue. It's just something that's a little bit outsized in your thinking. And ours is the log cabin. You know, you can come from humble circumstances, you can do great things. It doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. But without a quality education, it's simply not true.
Do you feel any special responsibility or any role that you should play because you're the most famous African-American woman of your generation?
Well, there's some others out there who might take that title. You know, I think it's terrific that we've had 2 black secretaries of state. I think it's terrific that we have a black president. These are all great things. But still in this country, race is a factor, and it's particularly a factor if it's combined with poverty. I feel a special responsibility. When I was Secretary of State, of course, I had to do the things that Secretary of State did, but I took a special interest in trying to diversify the foreign service of the State Department. I used to tell people I could go all day at the Department of State from meeting to meeting and never see anybody who looked like me. And that's not right for a great multi-ethnic society. And so whether it's diversifying faculties or the State Department, we've got to do it.
I do want to close this conversation by letting you know that it's been a privilege on behalf of Friends of Faith to sit here and chat with you.
Thank you, Belva. And it's a privilege with you. Thank you.